Thanks,
Oh,
Lisa.
your hair is so fabulous. I guess.
I thought it took me a long time to get in. I mean, I had to wait a while. So.
Yeah, just got a little nervous that maybe it was because I was the first and then came Olive and then came me. And but this is the correct link, right? Because it's the link we use.
Right. And Sarah Beth says she's logging in now.
Okay.
Hi, MeHee.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
So nice you're here, Olive.
Yeah.
Yes, nice to meet you, Olive.
Nice to meet you too.
I'm the nice one, Olive.
We're not going to disagree with that, Elaine.
I have to get something in there, MeHee, because see, those other ones, they'll try to act like they're the nice ones. I want Olive to know.
Right. No, you should trust.
Olive, welcome. We
Thanks.
appreciate you joining us
Mm-hmm.
on this
Happy to
project.
be here. Yeah.
So I'll just tell the three of you I'm off camera right now because I have a little bit of a bloody nose. So I'm hoping it will stop
Oh,
it's at 4. But
what happened? You okay?
Yeah, it just when it's dry outside, I get this period. I've always kind of get this, like when it gets dry outside. So
yeah, when I get that, I've had problems with my allergies or sinus stuff. So
hopefully it will stop before
Is that your Halloween effect?
That's right. So, but I don't come on right away. If I go off again, you'll know why.
MeHee, are you ready? Is there anything you need?
No, Anna and Norbert and I met last week and kind of went over the format a little bit. And Norbert's really, I mean, he's going to be the star. I mean, the work he's doing is so amazing. So we really want to just kind of highlight him. And there's some questions that we can ask if, things get kind of slow, but I don't think they will. Yeah.
Great.
So,
okay.
I think Anna's going to kind of lead us off and do the introductions, and then Norbert will talk a lot about some of their work, and we'll kind of just jump in.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And MeHee, this is Olive Hayes, student in the MAP program.
Oh, great.
He is chair of the undergrad and dean of undergraduate studies for the whole university.
Nice to meet you, Olive.
Nice to meet you too.
And Dr. Parker Gills teaches in the undergraduate program and has for many years. Wonderful classes that I always wish MAP students could also be in the undergrad program because it's just so good.
I've had many of them as they pass through.
Yep. Yeah, Katie
Holtz.
Holtz.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard great things from people who went to the undergrad there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think sometimes they think MAP is going to be more like undergrad, and so they're like, oh, MAP is
Yeah.
good, but I miss the undergrad too.
Yeah. Olive, where did you go to school before you were at Antioch?
Went to Michigan State University.
Okay.
Oh, I was born in Michigan, Olive. So, and I have a couple cousins at Michigan State and University of Michigan.
Nice. Yeah, the rivalry is intense.
They have a great publisher out of Michigan State. They publish really good little books. Yeah.
Through the university?
The University Press.
Cool. I think I read one for a class. Like it was like, hey, yeah.
Are you from Michigan?
I was raised in Illinois and Michigan, both places, but mostly in Michigan.
Dr. Gill, did you study in Michigan as well?
Oh, no, because we came out here when I was a teen.
Okay.
So I only went to elementary and part of middle school in Michigan, and everything else out here. So David seems to be running a little late, and Anna and the other guests, huh?
Yeah, I'm surprised.
Yeah, I'm surprised too. This is definitely the right link, right?
No, it's the right thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
I got
I
it from
got
Norbert,
You-
guys.
What we used last time.
I got to it from the Sakai site.
mhm.
Yeah.
And then Sarah Beth said, I'm logging in now. So I said, where are you?
See, I wonder if people are at a different, Sarah Beth just said, where are you?
No, I'm saying it to
Oh,
her
you
because
heard her.
she told me a few minutes ago she was logging in.
We also usually have people in the waiting room by now.
You can text Anna and see.
Who is the host of this meeting?
I think I am just because I was here first. Oh no, here's someone. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
there's Sarah Beth.
Hello there.
Hello.
Oh, there's
Hi.
Anna.
There's Anna. We're beginning to wonder if we were in the right place. Sarah Beth, where are you? What's your background there?
I'm standing at the waterfront in Seattle,
Nice.
about to hand off my granddaughter to her mother.
Oh,
So I might actually get disconnected, and I'm feeling so great today.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's a very dramatic background behind you.
I'll show
how
you.
was
It's
how was
even-
the visit? How was the today with your granddaughter?
it was great. You know, she's just so easy. This is where I'm at
Oh,
On the-
that's beautiful.
on the water
Beautiful.
here in Seattle.
That's great.
I just live like 2 blocks from the school, so I this is my walking zone.
Oh,
Nice.
that's nice.
Yeah, yeah, she's sleeping here.
Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah, how are you all?
Good.
I'll send that to Norbert. Anna.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm having problems. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm having problems with the Anti-AAPI account. It's just I don't know.
Yeah.
10
it's
minutes
cr-
ago, it kicked me out and I
It's
can't
everyone
get
needs to
in.
create a new password and I think.
So
if you
now
have
I'm
one-
joining from my own personal account. Let me see. I cannot hear you.
Oh,
I can't hear you.
Yeah, I was having
Um,
problems with my account
Okay,
earlier.
can someone send me the link? Let me see.
oh, I just, here, I'll write to you, Anna. I just sent
Built-in
it
internal.
to.
Yeah, that's right. Same speaker output.
I'm so excited for this one. This is going to be a fantastic, messy
Okay.
conversation.
I can finally hear you now.
Oh,
Okay,
yay.
great.
Yeah, I've been telling everyone, Anna, what a great conversation we had with Norbert last week. I just really so inspired by his work, and he's just the organization he's been working with, it but just everything he's touched. I mean, he's just
MeHee,
really,
can you send the link to Norbert?
yes.
Find it, and I can't get onto NTR at all.
Yeah, I just sent it to him, or at least I emailed it to him. I don't have his cell, but I emailed it to him.
That's it. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean,
No, that's okay.
Breathe,
it's-
breathe.
I think it's the password thing. I had problems earlier and Lisa had to send it.
totally kicked me out, and I can't get in. I can't see the email. I have a class later, but I'll think about it later. The messy conversation. Okay. All
And
right.
it's kind of rough how they do that password.
I don't know.
I-
It's to send it to my personal email, And this personal email is correct, but I didn't get I didn't
The
get
same with me. Yeah, same with me.
You could have it sent to your phone because I couldn't get into my personal email because it's also Gmail, so it was all shut down. But I think you can have the code sent to your phone. I mean, I
Oh,
did. I know you can. If that helps.
I don't mind them doing it to me, but not 15 minutes before I have to host
Not
it.
week 3 of the quarter.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
well, it's all gonna be fine. He'll be on and it's gonna be a great conversation.
All right, we just wait for Norbert, and MeHee is here.
I'm just texting a couple people to see who normally come to this, to see if they're stuck somewhere.
I wonder if this is part of this might be part of the problem.
Oh, yes. You know what? I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ross,
I apologize for getting here late. I've been having a hard time connecting.
Everybody has, David.
Darn it.
And we're thinking that our guests might be stuck as well.
Yeah.
I mean, our audience.
It's not a best practice the way this was done.
Are you ready to let people in?
Well, not yet. We don't have our other main conversations.
Norbert? Oh, here.
We have MeHee and Anna.
Yeah.
I think we should still let people in and just
Oh,
say
okay.
we
Yeah.
do.
Oh, there's Norbert.
Yeah, Norbert's
There's
done
Norbert.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
There he is.
ready to go?
hello, Norbert.
Hi, Norbert.
Hi, can you see me?
Yep.
I see
Yes.
some friends. And is my background right side up or is it backwards?
It's flipped,
Backwards.
it's backwards.
It's backwards. Oh my
That's
goodness.
intriguing, though.
I wasn't sure if that was a
Yeah.
statement you were
It's
making.
intriguing. We want.
That is what folks say. They say it's either a statement or something. I do have the other version. Let's see. Is
There you
that better?
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's backwards to me.
All right, Olive.
Okay.
Oh my
Okay, I'm gonna
goodness.
let people in before we lose them.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
I let everyone in so far.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, great. So we're doing it this way, right? We're not doing a webinar. Oh, good. So we can
Yeah.
we can see folks.
Yep.
See and talk to folks.
Wow.
So
Is that Sherry Gersh? Oh my goodness.
We just
Wow.
Yeah, sure. She was first.
I'll give a couple minutes to let everyone.
Hello, Norbert, Tan, my
Hi, what are-
Facebook pal. I wouldn't miss this.
Oh my gosh. You know, when Anna Kwong asks, you just jump on Zoom and see what happens. And MeHee's here. Great. Let me see. Wow.
Okay. All right. I think we are ready to start. I think now so far we have 33, 34 participants, and some more will join a bit later. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are zooming in. I am Anna Kwong, one of the organizers of the Messy Conversation and the chair of the Santa Barbara undergraduate program. Welcome to the 4-quarter second Messy Conversation. Our topic today has been long anticipated. Stop AAPI hate. Well, it has been going on throughout the nation, so it's about time for have a discussions about it. Before we invite our conversationalist, allow me to acquaint you with a few housekeeping protocol. I think those of you who join us every week are totally familiar with that, but please bear with me. Please keep your mic muted until you're invited to speak, but feel free to post your questions, concerns, or statements in the chat box throughout the event. Our conversationalist will speak for about 30 minutes and we will open the discussion to include the rest of the audience. We typically record our event. It's being recorded right now. If any one of you is not interested in showing up in the recording, you can turn off your camera. However, I think most of you are aware that unless you speak, your video will not be featured. So with no further ado, join me to welcome our conversationalist. Well, Norbert Tan, one of the most popular person at Antioch, and I'm sure everyone, quite a few of you actually know him. Norbert Tan served as a Deputy Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, which is one of the founding coalition partners of the Stop AAPI National Reporting Center. He's also a certified executive coach, certified interim executive, and nonprofit consultant. I'm sure many of you remember that Norbert served as the past Associate Vice Chancellor for Institutional Advancement at Santa Barbara, Antioch. He earned his MBA in Nonprofit Management from UCLA and his Bachelor in Business Administration from UC Berkeley. Our second conversationalist is just as popular and well-known in Antioch, okay? Dr. MeHee Hyun is a core faculty and chair of the undergraduate studies at Antioch University, Los Angeles. She also serves as co-chair of the University Academic Council and dean of the undergraduate studies for Antioch. She's my boss, okay?
That's why she's saying all this stuff about being popular, right?
Her doctoral work at UCLA focused on college students' commitment to racial understanding and inclusion, and emphasis on Afro-American studies. So welcome both, our very popular people. And Norbert, MeHee, that's you.
Thanks, Anna, for bringing us together. As Anna said, we're really fortunate to have Norbert join us, that his work across a number of different organizations is really something that I think we all can learn a lot from. Just in our conversation when we talked about it last week, I found it really enlightening, and I really want to highlight some of the good work that he and his organization are doing. And so we thought we would start with Norbert kind of giving us some overview of some of that work. And I know Anna's got some questions that we can pose as we go back and forth, but we also do want to encourage if folks have questions to, again, post them in the chat. But I'm going to start by turning it over to Norbert.
Well, thank you, MeHee, and thank you, Anna, for inviting me back. And I have a soft spot, obviously, for Antioch, and spent a year or so with many of you doing fundraising and community building. So it's just great to be back. And, when you leave Antioch, you never know what's going to happen. So I'm here to tell you crazier things can happen, right? And let me set the stage. I was, after I left Antioch, I was doing some executive coaching and consulting, and I went through a program. Some of you, I think, know Ken Saxon up in Santa Barbara, Leading from Within. I went through their Courage to Lead program several years back, and one of my cohort members, Manju Kulkarni, is the executive director at the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and we became fast friends, but I also became her executive coach. And so I had been coaching her, and then we all know what happened 18, 19, 20 months ago with the onset of the pandemic. Unfortunately, the previous office holder in the White House started saying some crazy things about Kung flu and China virus. And that really created an environment that fomented a level of anti-Asian racism that we haven't seen at this level for a while. I mean, I do have a lot of my Caucasian friends call me and text me, "Oh, are you okay? I can't believe this is happening." And I have to say to them, systemic racism, unfortunately, has been around longer than 18, 19 months. And certainly in the African-American community, we know this is a 400-year plus issue. With the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, this has been going on for a long time, 200 years back, Chinese Exclusion Act. I was just on a webinar with the 1871 Chinatown Massacre in LA, which many people don't know about, so you can Google that. But Unfortunately, what happened 18 months ago, there was an incident in LAUSD middle school, and a young boy got beat up and called coronavirus. And we helped with sort of get in front of that incident and get the report from the young student and his mom. And then we called some partners up in San Francisco, and they were seeing this happening too. Elderly folks being pushed, or folks getting spit on or called names at Costco. And we said, this is crazy. And we called Department of Justice and said, are you guys tracking this? And they're like, no, they weren't doing anything. So we actually decided to create Stop AAPI Hate as a reporting center. And what has happened was, as of today, we're near to about 11,000 reports of hate incidents. And obviously, as you all know, last mid-March with the Atlanta shootings, that was our focusing moment, I think, in the Asian American Pacific Islander community, where we didn't want to be silent anymore, and we had to just speak up. And this was just ridiculous, and that also increased the level of reports to our national reporting center. So since we have almost 10,000 reports, we've been able to really do a deeper dive in what that says. And folks who are actually willing to report to our website, 2/3 are women that have reported to the website. These incidents are taking place in public spaces, stores, schools, workplaces. Unfortunately, a lot of folks say, well, don't we have hate crimes legislation and this, that, and the other? And we were part of a recent hate crimes bill that was passed earlier in the year. But, less than 5% of these incidents are hate crimes. They're actually incidents where they're frankly equally traumatic. I was just reading the New York Times today reported that 40% of Asian Americans are feeling anxious and depressed over these past 18 months, a really ridiculous number. And I know many of you are involved with Antioch's psychology program and stuff, and the mental trauma that we're experiencing now, but in the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we'll be seeing more of in the coming months. And so we've 18 months now, what we've also done is really looked at how we can move this moment forward, and what we can do in terms of really 3 areas of education equity. So talking about ethnic studies, and I know you all know Governor Newsom just signed AB 101, which is going to require ethnic studies requirement in 2030 for high school seniors. And I think I was preaching to the choir here. We're not going to police our way out of racism, right? So a lot of what we're talking about is restorative justice, ethnic studies, policies, talking about how we can make the community safer. So there's a wide range of things we're working on right now. We have the benefit of, frankly, seeing how the movement for Black Lives and our allyship with the movement for Black Lives has helped what that community is doing in terms of policy changes and distribution of funds. So Movement for Black Lives has raised about $100 million over the past year, right? So we've raised a lot of money because of the nearly 100,000 donors that have given to Stop AAPI Hate over the past 18 months, because folks really want to see things happen. So that was a bit of a ramble, MeHee. So I'm going to stop there, but that in a nutshell is what has been keeping Norbert a little busy since he left Antioch University. So MeHee?
Yeah, and again, I think we were hoping that we would have a little bit of a conversation between the two of us. And I know there are a few issues that I'm curious about that would love to hear you talk a little bit more about some of the work. specifically that Stop AAPI Hate has been doing, that it was honored recently in Time Magazine for having part of the top 100 most influential people, and how any of that press has changed some of the work that you're doing, or highlighted different kinds of work. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about some of that.
Yeah, you know, and the Time 100 was certainly a wonderful honor, but that's really because we had 10,000, 11,000 courageous Asian American and Pacific Islanders report what was happening to them in real time, right? So, and it has been certainly a team effort with our other coalition partners. So it's raised the visibility, because I think, as all of you know, the model minority myth is actually not a good thing. It was coined by a white professor back in the day who was really trying to pit minorities against each other, right? To say to African Americans, hey, why are you marching in the streets about civil rights? Look at these Asian Americans, they're pretty quiet and they're doing fine, right? And that just really has created not a very helpful model when, especially, we're talking to legislators and they think we're all fine. And, you know, one of the things we're pushing for is the disaggregation of data, because just like in the Latinx community, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is so diverse. So it's really not helpful to think of us as one monolith. And so one of the things, obviously, the past 18 months has helped us. It's really increased visibility and allowed our different voices from our community to be heard. And it's also allowed us to really address some of the issues within our community, whether if there's, you know, there's been an issue of anti-Blackness in our community. We have folks, you know, going back to the riots in the 90s in LA, right? We've had to really, our Korean American partners have said, look, we learned how to really create allyship with our African American brothers and sisters from those riots. And moving forward, we really want to be mindful of how we characterize what's happening in our community. We have some folks in the Asian American community, you know, maybe in Orange County, saying, you know, let's just hire more police and more surveillance and all of that, because it's African Americans who are pushing our elderly down the street, and is totally really mischaracterizing what is happening. So we're very careful as we're moving through this situation. So
I'm really glad you brought up sort of that diversity of experience within the community, and with any sort of racial group, there's always that myth of the monolithic group X. But I do think in the Asian American community, it's interesting, particularly because for many Asian Americans, they don't see themselves as a group, right? Which I think may be a little bit different for some of the other minority groups that I think, Norbert, you and I talked about sort of the diversity of experience, even within our own backgrounds. My parents grew up in Malaysia and Korea under Japanese occupation. So the idea that they were part of a group with Japanese folks was really offensive to them, right? And so you and I both talked about coming from a largely homogenous, predominant white, or, you know, other areas, and having an experience going to college for the first time, being amongst a large group of Asian students, and realizing, oh, people think we're part of the same group, and that being kind of jarring to really think about, oh, we're supposed to think of ourselves as a coalition, when that never occurred to us, either because of the lack of numbers as we were growing up, and also because of these sort of different cultural and political and social factors, that the way that we identify.
Right. I mean, even just going back to really tracking the coronavirus and how it's affected the Asian American Pacific Islander community, all the numbers are different in terms of infection rates, vaccination rates between maybe certain East Asian American communities, Pacific Islander communities, Thai communities, Southeast Asian communities. It's all different. So we really have to be careful in how we characterize that. And yeah, and we're really, it's just been in incredible time. We're getting a lot of, we've been to the White House, right? So the Biden administration is actually taking us seriously. Our executive director was in front of the Congressional Judiciary Committee. It's the first time in 30 years that the committee held a hearing that addressed Asian American and Pacific Islander issues. Kind of phenomenal, right? And they also put in a special deputy in the White House to address Asian American and Pacific Islander issues, again, for the first time in, I think, a few presidencies, believe it or not. So, we're getting the visibility, and it's also not a zero-sum game. Again, this is about really how do we combat white supremacy and systemic racism, and we have to do that as all communities of color. It's not just going to be the African American community or the Asian American community or the Native American community doing their own thing. I mean, we really have to address this together. So that's something we're being really mindful of. I mean, we know there's a bit of a moment now, but how do we sustain the movement moving forward is something we're looking at, because unfortunately we're not going to solve systemic racism on this call alone as much as we want to. So we're really looking at this in the long term.
Yeah, you mentioned the Atlanta shootings and the White House's response to that, and I guess I'm interested to know, what do you think we learned as your organization, community, nation from those Atlanta shootings?
Yeah, what we learned is we also need to address the intersectionality of not only violence against Asian Americans, but gender-based violence, a huge issue, gun violence, huge, all of that needed to be addressed. We have some folks in the Asian American community going out and buying guns, and we're like, that's really not the way to go. So there's just a lot of intersectionality issues that we're dealing with. I mean, we learned that we really have to call folks out, right, on law enforcement, right, that I think the police officer or the detective said, police chief said, this white kid had a bad day, and we needed to really get in front of that and just say no and get out there and protest. And I think politicians saw sort of the numbers and the outrage. The COVID-19 hate crimes bill that was passed, I think it had 98 to 1 vote, almost unanimous vote in the Senate, which would never happen with anything else. So I think, we're making progress. So we're just out there. We're really more concerned about certainly right now, the mental effects of mental trauma of what's going on in our community. Also, this article this morning talked about how in our community, seeking therapy, for example, is not seen as acceptable. I mean, I joke with my Jewish American friends who each have like a therapist for each family member, right? We don't do that in the Asian American community. We don't really talk about needing therapy or talk therapy or getting through things. So this is going to be really something that's we are working with our community on. We issued we had a youth campaign this summer where youth did a survey with a couple of thousand students, and we found a lot of issues of online bullying and the mental health effects of our young people, not only being home for a year and a half, dealing with all of this anti-Asian racism and online bullying. So a lot going on there.
Yeah, to me, it really did signify, perhaps for the first time for me, a sense of unified Asian identity in a way that I hadn't felt before, right? So I do think the sense of having a Korean identity, a Chinese identity, those kinds of separate interest groups, for the first time, I really think the Atlanta incident was a unifying moment for groups to realize how much could be done across different identity groups.
Yeah, and it's a chance for us to have folks really know their history and say, you know, before Atlanta, there were a lot of things like Vincent Chin in the 80s, who was, you know, beaten by two Detroit auto workers because they thought he was Japanese, and they beat him to death with a baseball bat, you know, and before that, obviously Japanese internment. I'm just sort of backstory. I'm second generation Chinese American. My mother, ethnic Chinese, grew up in French Vietnam. My dad, ethnic Chinese, but he grew up in Dutch Indonesia, right? So they came to this country in the 50s, and their experience with racism was very interesting because at the time my mom got off the bus, she got some scholarship to Spalding University in Kentucky. They stop at a gas station somewhere in the middle of Kentucky, and she looks up in the bathroom, say colored and whites, and she didn't know what to do, you know, or barely knew English, you know, and that was sort of a moment she tells me about. And then my dad, when he was on business in Washington, D.C., a couple of days after Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King got assassinated, he was driving and cars were being stopped because white folks were being pulled out of cars and beat up. And he could see the mob, you know, march towards him. And they got to his car, looked at him, and then kept going, you know? So this concept of Asian Americans being seen as perpetual foreigners and outsiders, I mean, that's really a thing that is continues to be an issue here and a point of education. You know, I'm married, my wife Tracy is fourth generation Japanese American. So I've married into a family where I have firsthand knowledge of Japanese internment camp and what that atrocity was like. I mean, I grew up in New York, so we learned about the Holocaust in school, and I knew nothing about Japanese internment until I moved out to California, right? And it's the same. I go back to, you know, the summer, the 100th anniversary of Tulsa. How many of us on this call didn't know about Tulsa until their adult life? I mean, it's horrifying. It's horrifying that we didn't learn about that. So, you know, there's just a lot of, but we think this history and ethnic studies, that's going to help. And the evidence, there's a lot of evidence out there saying students who take ethnic studies at a university, you know, they're less likely to promote racism, et cetera, et cetera. So there's data to prove that ethnic study works.
Right. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. My dissertation was looking at the differences between different racial groups and their willingness and interest in engaging in those types of courses, and that typically students entered into college all by the time they finished increasing their interest in promoting racial understanding, but because students of color tend to take those classes more, that they increase at a greater rate, such that actually at the end of 4 years for a traditional student of college, they're further apart than they were in the beginning. So even though all groups are increasing in their commitment to this area, because students of color, and in my study, particularly Black students, tend to take those classes, engage in those conversations, explore those issues at a much greater rate, they're actually further apart after 4 years, which is, you know, not something that you would expect. You would expect people to be coming closer together. But I'm also really interested, Norbert, in kind of the conversation we'd had last week too, about sort of that idea of sort of Charles Yu talks about in that Interior Chinatown, for those of you that read that book, about the idea of second class oppression, right? And the idea that for a lot of Asians, recognizing that this is a different kind of racism than Blacks experienced under slavery. And so how do we participate in those kinds of conversations? And so there's this reticence to claim racism in a lot of the Asian American communities, this sense of both this second class oppression, as well as other fears about being deported, fear about returning to the country of origin. But there's almost kind of this deference to higher levels of racism that negates and erases the experience that people are having, because they feel like, well, both as a self-defense mechanism, but also a recognition of where some sort of mythical racism scale that also prevents people from speaking out And then also, as you said, Norbert, then prevents us from participating and joining forces with others who are experiencing this in all different levels and all different gradations.
Yeah, absolutely. And for some of us, on this call who are on the older side, we'd experienced the racism as kids and as young adults all the way in adulthood. And as MeHee said, as an Asian American male, I know I don't get pulled over once a month like my African American male friends, right? So I'm not going to talk about the racism I experience, institutional racism, workplace and school, all of that, because it is, we're not getting shot and killed by the police, right? So we're not supposed to really talk about the racism we're experiencing. So that's, I agree, MeHee, it's great that this is uplifted, because I think it's still part of the problem.
I think on the other side too, because it's seen as not as severe, it also allows people to express it more openly, right? So when I talk to my family and my friends, right, people don't have as much concern about expressing those kinds of things. So, I mean, I'll tell you that every December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, that when I was growing up, kids would make comments to me, even though, like I said, the Japanese were on the other side of what, my parents were oppressed by. That those comments are seen, that it's a little easier to make them, that it's not seen as being quite as threatening. I'll say, we talked about MeHee here at Antioch. When I was working admissions, I used to have students, prospective students, say, when they knew my name, "You speak really good English," right? And that that sort of willingness to say those kinds of things, I think also comes from that sense of second-class oppression. That sense that, well, this isn't really seen as the same level of racism, the same level of concern, so that it is more not acceptable, but a little easier to express some of those kinds of sentiments.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, but you can see that on the chat that we have quite a few questions. But before we get into the chat, I want to ask you this question that I've been burning to ask you the question. We talked about that the racism is very different from the African American, and Asians are taught now. I think you and MeHee are ABC, or American born Chinese. I'm not. I'm an immigrant, but I don't know whether your upbringing is that we tend to downplay any conflict. And we're taught to kind of like, don't cause any trouble, just be good. If something happened to you, just take it. Do you feel that because of that personality, that hurts us or it helps us in a society like in America?
Well, yeah, I mean, that characterization has not been helpful, right? So we have the bamboo ceiling, right? So we don't, in the workplace, we're seen as, they're going to be quiet and not say anything and not speak up in the workplace. And those of you that know me at Antioch, that wasn't the case. I think there were definitely some senior managers, and I know Mark is here. I get to say hi to Mark, and Mark was not one of them, but clearly there's management that's like, oh, this guy's going to be quiet and raise some money for us, and he's not going to really make any waves or ask any questions, right? So I think it's one of those things where we have to really understand our history, but yeah, I mean, it's constant education. And I know for our colleagues of color on this call, I mean, it's exhausting, right? So every interaction I have to project, and then maybe this is just me, but I have to project like I'm not a stereotypical whatever quiet math geek who's blah 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 who plays a violin, right? So, or who's not going to speak up. So that's sort of like an everyday thing, right? And like my African American male friends, they know, for example, how they need to dress and act and present in certain situations, and it's just something that is built into our daily interaction. And, you know, I love that this is called Messy Conversations, because I have some of my white friends who are just like, gosh, this is really uncomfortable. I'm like, welcome, you know, you get to be uncomfortable for 5 seconds here. We've been uncomfortable our entire lives and having to deal with all of these issues and address these issues. So we're really glad that there is more visibility. And you know, certainly the younger generation. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and we just took her and some girls to see Shang-Chi, and she said, oh, Daddy, I think this is my favorite Marvel movie, you know? And so her generation, they get to see people who look like them on screen. And, you know, when we grew up, there was no one, right? Like the cook in Happy Days maybe, or like the one actor, the same, you know, Joy Luck Club, the same 4 actresses in every movie, right? So that's certainly changed. So.
I remember the day that my brother and I first saw an Asian person in a commercial. We were adults and we called each other like, oh my gosh, did you see the Asian person? And it was in a got milk commercial. We're like, Asian people don't even, we're lactose intolerant. Why are we in a got milk commercial? But the thing, you know, Norbert, that you're talking about, I think is really important to think about how, you know, how we bring all these issues up. I think it is a really painful issue for a lot of folks to talk about. And so, you know, thank you, Anna, for that question. I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, and I'm going to address, I think, you know, David had a question about, I'm sorry, this is probably out of order, but perpetual foreigner. Yeah, I mean, if, you know, and I didn't want to, you know, drown you guys in PowerPoint, but obviously there's a lot of history back with the railroads and scapegoating Asian Americans. If you just sort of Google perpetual foreigner and just all of the images and all of that. And there was actually a lot of blaming back then about Chinese men bringing viruses, you know, to the United States and spreading. So this is unfortunately, you know, we've seen this movie before, and how we're going to address it as a community is really the big question. And, you know, David, in terms of language differences, and how does this, yeah, one of the things we're trying to do is really be more inclusive about the different languages that are spoken in this country by our community, you know, in language services. That's been a huge issue with vaccination and COVID outreach, right? A lot of materials, especially a year ago, they weren't in Asian languages. So folks didn't know what was going on. So our organization did a lot of outreach there. So yes, that is certainly an added dynamic, I think, in the AAPI community that we have to deal with.
Well, and I think it's not just language, right? So when we think about who immigrated here and sort of first and second, third waves of immigration, that's sort of the waves of Chinese, Korean, Japanese immigration was primarily professionals who were coming here. I mean, sort of if you post railroad sorts of that wave of folks, my family, I think yours as well, Norbert, which is different from a lot of the Southeast Asian population who immigrated here and were not from those sorts of professional groups. And so that also is a different cultural divide, even within the different Asian groups, in addition to the language. But certainly, you know, you think of the Latinx groups, that they share a common language in a way that the Asian groups don't, that does prevent that. And as I said, there are lots of biases within the Asian American community about, you know, my parents all the time talk about the Chinese and the Korean, and that's who they are, right? So like the Korean people don't do that, the Chinese people do that. And then so that also, I think, is very embedded in those sorts of dynamics and where we're headed with it.
Yeah.
Trying to get around, yeah.
Yeah, and then, you know, Clarence's question about, is it possible that certain AAPI ethnic centered behaviors are responsible for the lack of reporting of violence over the last, absolutely. I mean, as Anna mentioned, we're just from the dinner table taught to just kind of keep our heads down and not make waves. And certainly, like the Latinx community, there's fear of, oh, if I report, am I going to be deported? Is it going to alert ICE, et cetera, et cetera? And we've seen that happen also with the pandemic. Folks are afraid to get vaccinated or afraid to go seek help because they're worried they're going to it's going to conflict with their immigration status. So
Okay.
Go
Let's go
ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
back to a couple of the questions. I think Aislinn Conroe, you have a question? Would you like to ask the questions?
Oh, yeah. I love her question because I was going to touch upon.
That's right.
So, Aislinn, thank you for your question. You said you can't help but feel suspicious about recent establishment of the Institute of China-America Studies in DC, one that may facilitate more racialized fear-mongering and unnecessary Cold War type hostility. Yeah, so so when President Biden said that he would investigate the Wuhan lab leak theory, we're like, oh boy, here we go. So the fact that they even pursued that, we knew there might be some blowback. So we actually communicated with the Biden administration, sent them a letter, said, you know, when you find out what's going on, so we are happy to learn the truth either way, just know, depending on how you articulate the findings of the Wuhan lab leak or not, that's going to affect how folks view Asian Americans. Already, the Department of Justice dropped a whole bunch of cases. They're sort of closing down their China initiative. So a lot of you remember back a couple of decades ago with Wenho Lee, one of the professors at Lawrence Livermore Labs. I mean, they were just targeting any scientist, ethnic Chinese scientists, saying that we're all communists or in cahoots with the Chinese. And so fast forward now, there have been dozens of Chinese American scientists, Asian American scientists, and professors who have been targeted by Department of Justice, sort of not without any grounds. And I think fast forward, you know, how does that affect, you know, if Anna Kwong is up for tenure at Antioch University and Mark and a bunch of maybe other tenure committee, if they're just reading about this, oh my goodness, you know, is that going to tint their ability to grant tenure to an Asian American professor, right? So I could see that happening all over this country with this type of behavior. So it is something where the whole China relations is part of this too. I mean, we're being scapegoated all over the place, and we just have to be vocal about it.
Unfortunately, is that it is a real and present danger if you look at what's happening in Hong Kong. So kind of like it's as an American citizen, it's very hard. How can I tell who's a bad and who's a good person? I mean, it's kind of impossible unless they are willing to invest the time to look into the history, what happens. So I think it is complicated. I mean, you see, apart from being harassed, we constantly, as Asian women, I have to tell you is that there are people approach me and say, are you from China? Are you looking for a husband or something like that? I mean, I do get that. Obviously, I would smile and I just walk away. I mean, I won't make a scene. I mean, but it is annoying in many ways. Is that and I'm
dangerous, right? I mean, it's not just annoying; it's dangerous. And sort of the the question of one of the in the chat about sort of people in the Atlanta situation targeting women that they perceive to be sex workers. It's more than annoying, and for the extent to which that builds and foments, and the question is how else can we protect this vulnerable population? That's right, and that's such great work that Norbert's organization is doing. But I think that's a question for all of us, right? How do we address those kinds of things?
Yeah, also in addition to the anti-Asian racism work we're doing, AAPCON is also doing work in the health arena, mental health arena. We partner with 40 other Asian American nonprofits in Los Angeles. The Thai Community Development Center, they've been the leader in human trafficking in Southern California. There's just been some unbelievable cases, as some of you remember, in our region over the past couple of decades. So we're partnering with our member organizations are involved on the ground and doing all of this grassroots work. Let me see if
I
there
think
was.
another question from Mitch. Right?
Yeah, Mitch, I think we covered
The Atlanta.
some of this. Yeah.
I mean, it's related to what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Shirley's asking about the name of the organization. Shirley, which organization were you? The one that Norbert was just speaking of, or?
Yeah. Oh, so I'm sorry. So Shirley, I'm the deputy director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. And we're in downtown LA, and we are a consortium of 40 plus member organizations, all Asian American nonprofits in Southern California. In LA County, Asian American Pacific Islanders make up 1.5 million residents, so 15% of the LA County population. So one of the things we're doing is making sure that government services, local, state, federal, are proportional. I can guarantee you we are not getting 15% of the funding in terms of mental health services and some other things. So, and I used AppCon. We're actually changing our name because it's such a mouthful. We will be announcing our new name, AAPI Equity Alliance, later this year. We're super excited about it. New logo, the whole 9 yards. But we, again, with 2 other organizations up in San Francisco, the Asian American Studies Department in San Francisco and Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco, the 3 of us actually created Stop AAPI Hate as an initiative. So stopaapihate.org is not a separate nonprofit. We made that decision a little last year to keep it as initiative between the 3 coalition partners and help build capacity for each of our organizations as well. So
participants who have his hands raised. Patrick, Dr. Patrick Jefferson first, and then.
Oh my gosh, Patrick Jefferson.
I don't have a comment. I just want to say what's up to Norbert. We used to work together at Ventura College.
They hired you at Antioch? Oh my gosh. Wow. Terrific. No,
yeah,
Patrick.
I'm actually in Houston now. I just adjunct. I've been an adjunct since
right,
07. So.
Oh my God.
Anyways, once I logged in and say, hey, I know that guy.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no. Good to see you, Patrick. Wow.
You too, you too.
Yeah, so small world. And I think it's really about exposing our students and certainly faculty and staff just to different points of view. I mean, when Patrick and I were in leadership at Ventura College, leadership was pretty white, even though we're a Hispanic serving institution, right? For almost 50% of our students were Latinx, but the leadership, and certainly I was running the foundation, the Ventura College Foundation. It was not a very diverse board of directors at all. So right, Patrick, we had to deal with all of it.
Yeah, a whole lot of stuff. That's one of the reasons why I left, but that's another story.
It's like, come on. So it's ongoing, and we're really, humbled to be have a leadership role in educating sort of this, not only our next generation of young people, but frankly, all of the adults out there. We have, long ways to go. As we all know, over the past 1.5 years, it's been incredible. So certainly appreciate everyone here. I mean, Patrick, one of the reasons I came to Antioch, it was as a result of, I think, the 2016 election. A lot of us realized, wow, where do we want to be? What environment do we want to be in where we can just be in? I know Sherry and I talked about it, how can we be in an environment where we can really just be our best selves? And just kind of unbelievable time. So that's how I ended up at Antioch, certainly one of the motivations. And then, 2020 moving forward, unfortunately, we have a lot of work to do, because I think we were expecting maybe a different result in 2020. And we realized that there's 75 million voters out there that we still need to educate and say that we're here, and that a diverse, inclusive, equitable America is the way to go. So
We saw Clarence, and then Jane had a question in the
oh,
chat
Clarence,
too.
sure.
Should we go Clarence and then Jane? Clarence, you want to ask your question and then we'll come to Jane.
Well, I can defer to the great lady of Jane Paul, and then you can come back to me.
Okay. Jane?
Okay, well, that's awfully, awfully nice, but Clarence, you are ultimately the most considerate person ever. So thank you. And thank you all for having this conversation. It's wonderful. And I'm just thrilled to hear all of this. So I've just met lots of folks, so like young folks who work in social justice, whose parents were the immigrants. And some of their parents, so they might be very progressive and left-leaning, but their parents are not. And so, and again, like just, honoring the bazillion different stories. Just wondering, like in your work to build the movement, essentially, right, that you're building for safety, for public safety and for honoring people, how does just wondering if all that plays in.
Boy, yeah, you hit it. We have to remind ourselves that what I think it's, 30% of Latinx, 30% of Asian Americans, almost 30% of African Americans voted for Trump, right? So there's still folks in our communities of color that really didn't understand some of the issues in the Asian American community, especially the Vietnamese immigrant community. The minute they heard the word communist, that being fomented, of course, they voted for Trump because they're like, oh, we don't want communism anymore, right? So it's just, there was a lot of that. You have a lot of just a lot of misinformation out there. So we have a lot of work to do within the Asian American Pacific Islander community as well. There's certainly different strands of religious beliefs within the Asian American community. The Pacific Islander community, for example, a lot of folks in the military, very religious community within our bigger community. So they tend to be on the conservative side too. So, that affected our ability to do outreach, to do COVID outreach and vaccinations too. So,
and the generational issues, right?
Huge.
I think about Norbert, Anna and I were talking about how there are things, as Anna was saying, that we put up with that the next generation would not, right? That things that people said on, like I said, Pearl Harbor Day or this, like you laid low and you didn't interrupt that narrative because it didn't feel safe to you, didn't feel like you had the numbers. That is different, I think, for the following generations who have more of a consciousness about what's being told to them, what's being put upon them. I remember I used to do scholarship awarding for UCLA Alumni Association. And one of the things that I just found heartbreaking year after year was that you'd have these students, a lot of Asian American students would come in, and when you'd say, is there, you'd go through, they'd had this amazing list of accomplishments. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us, this panel of alums? And student after student after student, unfailingly would say, I want you to know I'm not the typical Asian, like geek. Like, I'm not the typical Asian nerd. Like, every single one of them, year after year, would say this. I'm not just, studying in my room all the time. I'm more than that. Like, it kind of broke my heart in a way to hear them really trying to combat against this sense of like, it doesn't come easy to me. You're talking about the model minority myth, about it doesn't come easy to me. I've had to work hard. It's not just because my parents told me to do this or that. Like, it was striking to me that these were, second and third generation kids who all had this narrative in their head that they felt like they had to say something and speak to this group of people who were just awarding scholarships, and so I think that the consciousness of different generations is really shifting.
Yeah.
That brings, if you don't mind, when I did my doctorate at UCLA, one of my good friends, he's Chinese American also, named Kevin, and he actually, I think, helped present on here once. he did his dissertation on underperforming Asian students. And one of the faculty members, it was an offhanded joke, just said, "Oh, there's a such thing," and the whole room went quiet. But that whole narrative, as you say, like there's a such thing as an underperforming Asian student at UCLA, was a big deal that people actually thought that wasn't a thing.
Right. Well, what we know, like Claude Steele, right, and all that sort of stereotype threat is that it doesn't matter whether the stereotype is positive or negative. Both of those things limit your ability to feel like you as an individual can contribute to your success. So it's all that Weiner sort of attribution stuff about how if you think that the reason you succeed or fail has to do with a fixed characteristic of your identity, then it takes away your individual ability to exert effort or to feel ownership or self-esteem out of it. So it doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, it still impacts you.
Yeah, and Patrick hit the key word. It's all about narrative change. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is really change the narrative across all of these areas I spoke about earlier. I think Clarence still has his hand up. Good to see you, Clarence.
It's good to be seen these days. But I just wanted to bring a little messiness into the conversation, since everyone's being so polite and so nice. When your former friend who occupied the White House espoused all of that, the framing, when we talk about narratives, the framing of the responsibility and the origin of COVID-19, and how he kept using those terms, as you pointed out earlier, when we started hearing about the number of attacks with Asians, especially here in LA and certainly with the older adults, I was not surprised. I wasn't alarmed. And I was even challenging my own empathy to a point as a Black person, especially as a Black man, because I was like, Stevie Wonder could have seen this coming with what was being said out of the White House, because that base that has been created would certainly take their marching orders from the signals and the symbols. What I love about this right now moment is that we have the opportunity to further educate people. This really invites the opportunity, because, I look at Black people, because I can only really speak from my own Black lens. I always say in messy conversations, just like ice cream, there are 32 different flavors of Black people. And it's the same with the AAPI folk. Every group is different in their cultural norms and in their behavior. What alarmed me was I didn't see a lot of collaboration during the Black Lives Matter, kind of highlight, the climax that was happening after George Floyd. And I thought, wow, certainly if they had been, feeling empowered, and like maybe MeHee said, maybe they didn't feel like they had the numbers to really collaborate with African-American groups to the point that they could forge some amount of not only political power, but just, human rights power. But understanding there's so many different ethnic groups, and many of you are taught to keep your head down, shut your mouth, get your work done, be professional, and kind of be as Eurocentric as you can and keep on moving invisibly through society. That's the impression I got. But as a Black man, and understanding the history that has gone on with Asian people in America, starting with the Chinese, I learned so much after we started Messy Conversations about my relationship as a Black person with Asian people. And it started out really long before this, and Dr. Gills can chime in on the whole Korean thing. We had to get rooted in our relationship with Koreans here in LA. I came to LA about 20 years ago. So we had to get rooted in that because of the violence that, Koreans were putting on Black people. So it's like, why is that happening? Why are they treating us like that? And then you started to break down their cultural behavior. Then you understood, and you go in one of their stores, they don't touch you because they don't touch. They're not going to put the change in your hands. Get over that. But I look also at the things that occurred post-Civil War. Post-Civil War, we go back that far, 1865, all the way back to there. I did not know until this year that when the slaves, the enslaved people, the Black enslaved people left the South, for those that did leave, how did they replace that labor? They took the leftover folk who were here working on the railroads, shipped them off to Alabama, Mississippi, and then those folk went to China and got more Chinese people and brought them to Alabama, Mississippi to help with the cotton industry as well as the rice industry. That was a shock to me. I never even thought about that being a thing. And food was what brought me to that understanding because, with the Chinese, Exclusionary Act, which I'm shocked MeHee didn't bring that up, there was a situation where Chinese people obviously were not allowed to buy any land. So they were able to occupy, buildings and property if it was not in, like one of the white neighborhoods. So they located themselves in Black neighborhoods. They had to live in their store or restaurant, and they serviced the Black community, mainly Black sharecroppers in Alabama and Mississippi. So I say all that to say, and I'll add one more thing, the Japanese. Black people looked out for Japanese's property here in LA. I learned that while I was at Antioch. We had to go downtown and look at certain markers and spaces in LA. I learned that, in Dr. Rose's class. So we've had these relationships with each of these groups in a very, very different way. So I was really kind of like, kind of hurt that I didn't see more, kind of overt participation in the Black Lives movement. And so I applaud you for making that collaboration with the Black Lives Matter organization and going forward, being an ally so that you too can be supported, because Black people have always supported the Asian community. Maybe with some reservation with the Korean people, but, with the other groups, it's been very much, a partnership. Black people looked out for Japanese people's property here in LA, when they were interned, and the Black folks looked out for Chinese people in the South. And there you have it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's all just amazing points. Thank you for uplifting all of that, Clarence. Yeah, I would say we do know there was a large, maybe it was a younger generation of the AAPI community that did support movement for Black Lives over the past 18 months. Yes, probably not as visible as you would have liked to see, in the media, but we were out there, and sure, yeah, there's still more work to do.
My favorite masks that I saw out there were the yellow peril supports Black Lives Matter, right? That was them.
There you go. Well, and there's so many just commonalities in the systemic racism. I would just learn, those sundowner rules, right, against African Americans. I mean, they had that against Asian Americans too, like the Chinese. Yeah. They were like, you better go home, otherwise we're going to lynch you. So, 1871 in LA, there was the lynching of 17 Chinese Americans right here in Los Angeles. Unbelievable. I didn't know about it. The Chinese American Museum here has an exhibit over, I think, the back half of this month. And it's unbelievable to learn our history.
That's Norbert. That's an amazing conversation. It's 5 o'clock now, so we have officially, it's a big topic for very little time. I'm sure many of us still have lots of questions. So our official part of the next conversation is done, but you're welcome to stay and look on more of the questions. So sorry, Norbert, that
this is like overtime or
kind of
extra minutes.
After hours kind of part. And as we go into that, I definitely want to thank Norbert, but I also just want to say, I hope we can have more of a conversation for those of you that choose to stay. I'll say that there are a lot of Asian American faces and names out there, people I haven't met in the Antioch community. I would love for you to stay on and for us to hear your stories and what you'd like to contribute to, because the idea is really not just for the three of us to talk, but to hear more. So I hope others will stay on, but definitely we want to thank Norbert for all of his work, not just today, but across the years in this important area. So
Great.
hopefully folks will stay on though.
And thank you, Dr. Lipinski. Good to see you on this call as well. Yeah, it's just, and I didn't even get to talking about allyship that Clarence talked about, as we're 1 month or so past 9/11. That was something, back in July, August, we said we're coming on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and we wanted to support our MEMSA community, our South Asian community, because we were not sure what was going to happen at the 20th anniversary, right? So it's something, again, we're just working with all the communities because we've unfortunately seen this movie before, and it's just how we address this moving forward. Any other,
I had
yeah, Patrick.
I think one thing with the week, and this is a long-term thing, there's still a lot of tension between Black community and the Asian communities in especially in certain lower income neighborhoods across America. And I spent a lot of time working in Compton, Watts, South Central, and there's still a lot of attention. And one thing I noticed is when a lot of these attacks, it was African Americans attacking Asian Americans, and that was heartbreaking for me. And one of the dimensions that I started looking at some years ago was like the economic dimension of it, where it was a lot easier for an Asian American to get a business loan, open up a store in a Black neighborhood than a Black person with education, MBA, to get a business loan. And those kind of things that kind of rooted that and fomented that opposition, so to speak. And I think we need to do a better job of kind of really uncovering that and talking about that. And there's been incidents in LA proper that kind of has pushed that kind of thing up to the forefront, but it has not seemed like a sustained conversation.
Yeah, no, and we're calling that out, especially in our older generation. I mean, there is anti-Blackness in our community. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and we need to really call that out, especially with our older generation, and find the roots of that and find how we can work together. I mean, obviously, there are beautiful stories like Clarence mentioned with Japanese internment. Also, many of folks in the Latinx community were looking out for Japanese American property and farms and all. And I know this firsthand through my wife's family. I mean, they would come back from internment camp, go to the bank. Of course, Bank of America took all their money, but then they had maybe a African American or Latinx neighbor that preserved their property. I mean, there are some beautiful stories out there, and we have a lot of work to do.
Other folks want to, like I said, it doesn't have to just be the three of us answering. Other folks who want to contribute their experiences or music. Yeah, Audrey.
Yeah, thanks to all three of you for facilitating this conversation. It's really fantastic to be here. I'm just thinking about Antioch's curriculum and how I'm not really seeing a lot of Asian American studies classes in our curriculum, and I'm wondering what would be your sort of I don't know, desire to kind of introduce this content into the academic landscape of our community.
Yeah, it's interesting, at least in LA, I don't know the numbers everywhere else, but in some ways the representation of Asians in our population is more underrepresented than other groups in terms of our student demographics. And that's also true in LA for the Latinx population as well, as pretty dramatically underrepresented. So, my bias has always been that sort of people's history sort of approach to where there really should be more integration of the different aspects of it, and so that it isn't just kind of an isolated aspect in the curriculum. I think that it's, especially we've got such a small curriculum, I always worry about offering things that run the risk of not being able to fill And so how we think about that across our different campuses is also an interesting idea, but.
Yeah, and is there a way we can integrate some of the Asian American history and experience in, whether it's an economics class or psychology class, just like you're all looking at DEIJ and Antioch, right? How do you address diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? And it's not, just hiring Patrick Jefferson to do one webinar and then we're like, oh, we're done for DEI all year, right? How do you integrate that into your curriculum, also into your practices as an organization? I think that's very similar to how we can integrate perspectives from communities of color across all of your curriculum.
Sorry?
Oh, I was just noticing there's a question in the chat about how non-Asians can get involved in advancing or advocating, understanding education equity. And again, I mean, there are things we could say. I'll also, again, see if there are other folks who wanted to contribute and have other perspectives, but I'm sure Norbert, Anna, and I have things we could say to that too.
Well, yes. I mean, we're we welcome everyone to the movement, right? I mean, it's, we also look to the Jewish American experience, right? How Jewish Americans supported African American civil rights movement. And we also see the anti-Semitism, well, now, but even back in the 50s, right, with not allowing Jewish Americans to enroll in Ivy League schools, for example. We saw the same thing with Asian Americans 30 years later, right? So it's about how do we all continue to work together, address this as a group, right? And not just one group addressing systemic racism.
Rosalie has a hand up.
It's really not a question, but more of a comment, because I really appreciate Audrey's question about how we can integrate this into the Antioch curriculum. I mean, I just wanted to share an experience I had at Antioch just last quarter. I was in a class, there was one African-American student in the class and the issue of racism came up. And for weeks, this poor woman, I mean, and she has obviously, I mean, her experience was important. The African-American slavery experience, discrimination is important. But at some point, it just became where she was almost forced to just have to respond to all this barrage of questions. And I felt for her. But what came up for me was that never in that whole 6-8 weeks did anyone ask what the Asian American experience was like in terms of racism. And I felt excluded, and I wasn't considered a person of color. And in that whole 8 weeks, mind you, we've had all these incidents, obviously, of Asian, I mean, elderly being, hurt out there, and that didn't even come up. And this was an Antioch. And the professor teaching that class was, Hispanic. So it was really a bizarre. So I for me, and that whole, I was really troubled by that. I think every single class I had, my paper was about AAPI, I mean, and that racism is occurring in our population, but yet we're not even part of that discussion. And that was at Antioch.
Right. There are so many, I guess, levels and problems, right? In terms of racism, sexism, all these isms that we encounter, that it is that, to me, a little bit of that sort of second class oppression feeling that.
Yeah, absolutely. My son, who's half Caucasian, who's only, when he was 5, just a couple of years ago, he was walking down the street with his nanny and somebody yelled at him, say, take that kid back to his country.
Oh, yeah.
He was born and raised in the US.
I think
every
Asian
Vermont.
Every Asian person I know has had that experience.
And but you're right, it's not something I talked about. It wasn't something that I look back now, back then, maybe perhaps it wasn't. I mean, I was troubled by it, but it didn't become an even bigger issue until what's happened in the last couple of years, and then even this incident at Antioch, really, I moved from the Philippines when I was 11. That was 35 years ago. And for us, it was about assimilation, about not being different, being, but fitting in, right? And that was in California. I went to school in San Diego. I didn't hear about Manzanar. I left at 18, moved to Washington, D.C., where being different, being Asian, being Filipino was honored. It was great. I moved back to LA. I didn't hear about Manzanar until I accidentally drove by on my way to Mammoth. And it was right there. And many people don't even know where Manzanar is. It's right there in California. But there's so much about that history that just is lost. And here we are at Antioch with all these woke people, and it's still.
Well, both to your point and Audrey's, right, that we have a Western-centered curriculum, that the dominance of psychology, particularly clinical psychology, is a very Westernized mode of thinking. And so I think that influences the kind of curriculum we offer, the perspectives that we have. And as Norbert referenced earlier, that's not a really dominant part of the AAPI experience in terms of how issues have been historically addressed, that's not how it's done. And so I think that frame, and again, it's not to speak ill of our psych folks, but I think that really changes the lens in a way that is problematic, right? And I think, to Audrey, to your question, I think some of that is about broadening, even within psychology, the way that we think about that field. I think about David's class, Politics of Psych, and other things like that, community psych, things that Theo teaches. And when I teach social psych, I talk a lot about that idea about how culture influences the way we think about behavior and collectivism versus individualism. And I think always trying to broaden the way that we think about, I think, clinical counseling psychology in particular, because it is such a dominant part of our Antioch experience, is another way to challenge some of that limiting, not just in terms of the AAPI experience, but for a lot of different sort of cultural minority groups.
Absolutely. And I think Meg had her hand up.
In response to Rosalie, I wanted to tell her about an experience that I had last semester. I was teaching, of all things, colonialism. And I'm actually a depth psychologist, so I'm in an interdisciplinary situation here. And my questions are always end up being philosophical questions, deep. I want to get to the question. Where does the question? What is racism? And when did it start? And how did it start? And so I found a wonderful book, 1493 by Charles Mann. And I was able to, for the first time, understand how slaves became Black. I know history. I mean, I can read Greek. I've got all that down. I've studied, thousands of years. But why did they become Black? It didn't make any sense to me logically, because the African civilizations were so wealthy. So why did they become Black? And I don't know if you know Charles Mann's thesis, but it's so well researched now, and it's about 20 years of scholarship. He realized that the Spanish, when they found a mountain of silver in Bolivia, which is now Bolivia, Potosi, I think is the name of the city, they brought, as all the conquistadors would do, oh my goodness, we got to get people. They go back to Sevilla, they go get all the people, they throw them down in the mine, force, violence, all that. And everybody dies except the Africans. Why?
Oops, I think Meg froze on us.
Yes.
Let's see if she.
Sorry, Meg. Zoom is not being.
This year didn't teach us anything.
Yeah, that's right.
So
there you are.
And so I had the strangest. It was the strangest experience, because I had my Spanish students getting really upset because they didn't know anything about that. I had my African students African-American students had never knew about that. But then when you start looking at the sugar plantations, look at all of the areas where chattel slavery started to grow. They're all malarial areas. And so what it did for us in the class, it was fascinating. It allowed us to talk about race as something that happened, I'm not going to say by accident, but it did not exist in the early 1500s, because you can see, if you in the paintings, a wonderful painting, the King's Fountain, you can see there are Blacks who are part of the royalty, and then there are Blacks that are merchants, and there are Blacks doing every kind of thing in the painting, along with whites doing every kind of thing. In other words, there's a kind of globalism that's blind to race. And then there's this really kind of long period of history. I mean, it goes from about 50, I think they found this silver in like 1540. And it goes from like 1540 till about, let's see, well, when did the British come to America? 16 something, 15, 16, 18, something like that. But chattel slavery didn't exist before that. So it's just this weird, we got to essentially address, how did this start? And the reason, why weren't the Chinese involved? Why didn't the Chinese go to America? Why didn't the Asians go to America? Well, they had a different culture, and they didn't, their whole thinking was more about putting a wall around themselves. So anyway, when we got into these discussions, what happened was so fascinating, because it was like, we were free to talk about race in a way that I hadn't felt free to talk about race in other courses and in other classes. And so it was fascinating. And the most fascinating thing was the upsetness, messy is the right word, of the Spanish students who didn't know all of this history and how intensely violent it was. So I just wanted to share that with Rosalie, because it really made a difference in how we were able to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and then, Meg, kudos to you for really creating a space where your students can have, again, these messy conversations. And I know that's part of the Anti-AAPI ethos. You all allow that to happen in your classrooms, which is great. So,
as you're talking, Meg, too, about sort of colonialism, I think it's such an interesting kind of to play with that word a little bit, and to think about the different ways that continues to be present in our lives. I think for a lot of people, they think of that as the 1800s. They think of that as a slavery kind of situation, and how current that is globally, right? And how much, I think about for the Asian nations, the Philippines, Rosalie. I think about, my mom often talks about when she was in Malaysia, that they were under, British, Japanese, Thai, back to British. Like there was definitely a colonial kind of situation, and how those different influences created the different dynamics there that exist today, even without those colonial influences, and the Malay and the Indian and the Chinese sort of those relationships. So again, back to Audrey's saying, like thinking about a class that looks at sort of colonialism, including sort of internationally, that again, because I think people think about it as a historical context and aren't aware that it's happening now today, would be a really fascinating course.
The issues in Haiti is one good example of that. One thing I want to say to follow up on, I think Meg just spoke, slavery is also very specific, because they went and got people that not only withstand malaria, but also had very specific skills and know how to grow certain things. And so it was very targeted on top of that as well.
And they couldn't own land in Africa. That was the other thing that fact made such a difference between the African experience and the European experience. And it's like, it's not racist, it's just historical. Only royalty could own land. So the African people would essentially take over the next village, sell those people. My first principle is we're all as good and as bad as everyone else. and when you start with that principle, you see everybody, you know, I don't have any kind of, I don't know, hierarchy of people. But once that I understood that historically, because how did they get those people? Then just understanding those 200 years, I would say understanding 1500 to 1700, those 200 years, it helps you really understand that the whole idea of race comes up right in that period of history. And my guess from a depth psychologist point of view is that it's a projection of your guilt. People must feel guilty of the horrors that they did to these people. And when you feel guilty, what do? You harm people. You know, it's a sad truth, but it's true. I live in Tennessee. And when you listen to white racist people, which I have to listen to because they're running the towns, there's some inner projection going on that's horrible. I wish I could give them all I wish I could bring them all to my Jewish therapist friends because they really need to get rid of that guilt so that they can stop the hate. It kind of somehow goes together.
I think you give them a lot more credit than I do. I think as far as being guilt, I think it's just some people they honestly believe that they're better than other people. And and that's a whole nother conversation, but you give them a lot more grace than I do.
Yeah, and that's the premise, Patrick, of systemic racism, right? That people have to put others down. So yeah, well, this has been, and I learned, I had a little mini psychology class from Meg just now. I love how you weave psychology and history and all of that in there. But it's really been great to be with you. And Anna, thank you so much for Anna, MeHee, and inviting me. I know we'll be continuing this conversation somehow because I think it needs to be. And, maybe we can have a panel of different people of speakers of color just from different experiences, because there's just so much intersectionality we need to really uncover here.
Yeah, and thank you again, Norbert. And really, I keep saying to people, it's such an inspiration to hear the work that you and your organization are doing. So that's really.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone. It's good to see all of you. I have to go help my 14-year-old with homework. She's in 9th grade, so it's
that's going to be harder
serious
than
now.
any of this conversation. Quite soon.
That's right. I have to get her off TikTok. So thanks so much, everyone.
Take care, Norbert.
Good to see you again, Norbert.
All right, take care, Patrick. Good to see everyone.
And thank you, MeHee.
Thank you, MeHee.
A wonderful conversation.
I'm gonna Anna and MeHee, I'm gonna jump off and we'll debrief at some point.
Okay, yes.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Gills. Bye.
I just wanted to check in. Carol hasn't said anything, but you've hung on for the conversation, whether you wanted to say anything else before we close out.
I entered the conversation slightly late, so I didn't want to interject, but I hear a lot of where does power come from for Asians, for Asian Americans? And I don't know, for myself, I've been just forming my own tables. And I think in class, when certain struggles are not highlighted, I don't see them as being invisible. I see that people bring up the issues that are prevalent to themselves. And I think that, I think having organized in New York City with in Manhattan's Chinatown, I feel like I think earlier when Clarence was talking about whether there's Asian organizing, or whether or where it's gonna go, I just think, how do I just think that the power exists. The power is there and the people are there. And that's what I'm sitting with now after this conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Carol. You inspired us.
Thank you.
Very hopeful. That's good. Excellent. We have any more other comments? It's 5:29 before we close out. Yes.
I'm going to head up too, but thank you, Anna, for bringing us together, and for folks for sticking it out. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to Dave.
Oh, I think Clarence. Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Meg. It says learn a lot. Patrick, Kelly, and Carol, return to see
Anna.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do we want the okay, our folks are here. Do we stop the recording? Good, all right. Oh, Lisa is gone.
Lisa had to go, yes.
Okay, all right, okay. Oh, it was wonderful. I mean, MeHee did most of the facilitation, but I hope that that's okay. You see, today it took me by surprise that I actually got tossed out from the Sakai, and I have a class to teach, so that was quite panicking. But anyway, what do you think? It seemed we have 50 participants.
Yes.
There are lots of mentioning about that. We should talk more about that. And particularly, I'm interested about the collaboration. Kind of like we started with Black anti-racism, but we should connect with other group, and Asian American will be another group, because the kind of, I think using the word suffering or challenges, it's too much, but well, it depends. Actually, it's suffering. It's that it's a different in nature, but nonetheless, the intensity is just right there. It's amazing to compare how racism actually can take shapes in different forms, taking advantage of each of our personality and our culture and our behavior. Asian American has a lot to do with what we were taught to be kind of like, be quiet, don't cause any trouble, I mean, just take whatever it is. And that's why most people didn't even think that it exists. They were very surprised that people thought that it's just, oh, this is something so new. But anyway, thank you, my teammates. It's wonderful. I mean,